Hello and welcome to this video on the world of graduate research and how it not only affects students during their study, but carries right on through their degree, or can bring their degree to a sudden and rather grinding halt. The video was triggered by a conversation with a graduate research student we met quite some time ago. They were explaining the research project and the goals, which seemed laudable on the surface. In short, how to better facilitate rehabilitation for patients with cardiovascular disease, as only a small portion of patients were going. This led to issues to do with recurrent cardiac events, morbidity, lower quality of life, and so on. Their problem was not the project itself, but it seemed to be quite a good idea and seemed like it would be funded well, after all. The government showed interest in this. But it was the university where they were enrolled, and particularly the supervisors, who failed spectacularly. This compared rather starkly with other graduate students we know, or have set out to get impressions from. In fact, it seems like the first student basically had the bottom of the barrel, and very much so. They may have been scraping right through the turds that were there in their experience. Where others seem to have had the premium sports car experience with all the bells and whistles that go with it. How much of this is a result of changing expectations by students, and how much is a failure of the institute and supervisors, does seem to be mixed. To clarify some terms first, by graduate research, we are referring to students who complete their degree by publishing a thesis with original research, or something similar, so it's either going to be a PhD or a master's. This is more than less always going to be after you complete your bachelor's or your initial bottom level degree. Since these degrees are just that, degrees, they are almost always awarded from a university or associated institute that is tied into a university. But for the purposes of this video, understand these are all university-specific scenarios. A graduate student must be supervised during their degree. In some countries, this is called an advisor or similar terms. The idea is that they are an experienced academic and researcher who can help guide the student through the process of their degree, effectively supervise them, and we'll use that term from now on to keep things clear. The type and nature of work they need to do for their degree will vary. For a master's level student, this is often either proofing an established method in a new context, so not necessarily novel, or it can sometimes be on par with a PhD but on a smaller scale where everything is novel work. A PhD is generally not only wholly novel research, but to some extent it will break new ground. In both these cases, the student is gradually weaned off of supervision as they grow or develop skills to complete their area of research and become more of an expert than their supervisor in their very niche topic. Generally, a master's student has less responsibility and control, as they're not expected to achieve as much, nor be as independent. Importantly, supervisors start from both a position of authority and responsibility. That is, they have certain responsibilities to impart knowledge, ensure students can succeed, if not must succeed, but can also succeed if they encounter any barriers, so long as they put the work in, mind you. This is not a free ride. The same institute, let's say, the student is enrolled in also has a similar degree of responsibilities. Understand, again, no free ride here. It is you actually need to do the work, and so long as you do the work, you should be able to succeed. These requirements are nearly always set in policies, rules, and similar at the institute level. These policies or similar often also include certain milestones or hurdles that students must pass during their degree. This will include some sort of document and presentation to establish their research is at least some level of novel or original to a panel or a similar body. There may also be a mid-study hurdle to show where they are up to and can complete their project on time, along with the necessary novelty to it, and that they haven't made any grievous mistakes, let's say. Later, they will prepare a near-end presentation showing that what they have done and ensure that it will meet the expectations or requirements for not only their thesis, but for their degree. Finally, there may be a defense or viva. This is almost exclusively a PhD thing. It is where you present your thesis in short form and get roasted by the panel and any other academic who shows up. It is meant to be a somewhat adversarial situation in which your thesis gets critiqued and, as the name would suggest, you defend said thesis. Sometimes it is good as you find issues that are often overlooked in more civil discussions, and other times it is an exercise in self-flagellation. Afterwards, your thesis is examined, or this may be done beforehand. The exact procedural steps aren't necessarily important, but what happens is your work is effectively peer-reviewed and then published by the university as a thesis. That is, they have a record of the thesis that can be accessed, and this is often through the university library. Afterwards, the student is expected to go on to further work, such as their own laboratory, as a postdoctoral researcher, industry, and so on. So now we know what's happening, roughly. We basically now have to look at a cross-section of students and locations, and, let's say, the struggle. What we did get was experience from Australia to start with, and we'd hoped for a more comprehensive response from British Canada, American, European contacts, and a few others. We were fortunate to have some responses, and particularly we were actually able to get an honours student to tell us about their experience on top of the others. And this kind of gives a cross-section, just at very different levels. That is, we look at the students who are literally spoon-fed what they need to graduate, versus those who should be completely independent. And so we'd like to thank those who did help us with our, let's say, development of this particular project. Let's start with the experience described by a student who was absolutely thrilled with their time and experience. Effectively, the extremely good side of the expectations and outcomes matrix. They went into this fairly simply. That is, they wanted to do the work and get the necessary support and, let's say, advice to pass through, and complete it at the end. But importantly here, they are an honours student, and so there is a big difference in the expectation here. Most of what they're doing is going to primarily consist of what can best be described as assignments. That is literally something that gets graded on the basis of a rubric, and it's very much a standard sort of thing. However, honours students still need to produce a thesis at the end. Admittedly, a very short and honestly not particularly valuable thesis, but it's an experience necessary to move on to things like master's or PhD level studies. What distinguishes this student from many others is twofold. First of all, their incredibly supportive environment, which not only had a primary supervisor, but an associate supervisor involved, and a PhD student who worked almost hand in hand with them, along with a variety of laboratory technicians. In terms of the environment, this is in reality both the best possible scenario and the worst. The other thing they had was arguably the necessary background themselves. They'd already done work in this laboratory prior to their honours year, and therefore had the grounding necessary to do a lot of things that they may not have otherwise had the experience and knowledge for. The good side to this for them is very simply that they had weekly meetings, if not more frequently. The daily lab time and constant support in the laboratory by a PhD student as well. This meant not only were the experiments as reliable as they can be, and they had constant oversight, support, and help, they also started their work in the middle of an established project. That means that they didn't need to develop, proof, or refine any of their methods. They effectively just had to go through the motions that they'd already been given. It's literally, run this experiment with this exact method we already know works from these other things, and tell us what the result is. This makes their experience as close to straightforward and simple as it can be. Literally, it's baby's first colouring book, or paint by numbers if you will. The problem is simply that the student did not get challenged. Everything came to them on a silver platter or silver spoon. Their work was effectively co-written by others who gave daily feedback and advice. They already had all of the necessary background from the PhD student who had gone through many of these same requirements for their initial work, their proposals, and so on. The supervisors and associate supervisors, or associate advisors and advisors, all provided necessary support and feedback, along with, as mentioned, already having a considerable amount of experience from this particular laboratory beforehand. Now, as mentioned, this had the following benefits in the long run. They were set up to go straight into a higher level degree like a PhD or a master's level, and they had a neat pathway, and the process to go from honours to master's degree or PhD was almost as straight a line as possible. This is great for speedrunning into a postgraduate position, but that isn't necessarily the best thing in all ways, and it's for a very simple reason. They weren't given what they needed to be able to grow and develop. You don't have those negative experiences that you need to go, I've hit a wall, how do I overcome this wall? It's a hurdle, can I jump it? Do I need to climb over it? Do I need to go around it? And so on. So it's not a bad experience from a student perspective. From an academic and developmental perspective, this is really not great. The average expectations are rather different. It seems incredibly hard to find a student willing to speak on this, and there's a variety of reasons for that, and perhaps the simplest one is that they have no strong views either way. There's also a certain negative impression, or let's say idea around those who would speak about their experience and possibly draw the ire of any current or future employers or colleagues. We did get some input on this, and we can talk about some of the experiences and what happened. Now, it's important to note here that this is aggregating several different people we've spoken to on the basis of anonymity, but understand that it's, well, to be blunt about this, it's going to be very broad in the nature of things. Just understand that. The first is simply that their problems for students are that a lot of the time, especially they're coming internationally, so if you travel from one country to another, and it's not part of some sort of, let's say, a Eurozone type thing, you actually have a lot of trouble, and you can actually find that things get really bad if you don't have the necessary support and infrastructure in place. So, for example, if your supervisor goes off AWOL or disappears and you don't know what to do. Now, if you're entering a laboratory that's established, there's a good chance you can be basically set up to pick up other work in that laboratory and do that, building up the necessary repertoire of tests, designs, cells, designs, etc., all of which to run your experiments later on. And that's certainly what some of them have described. A terrible supervision at first, followed by a project that actually went quite straightforward, and they've broken very novel ground in doing so. Others have found that the work itself was really just checkboxes. They would literally just do the work, they'd write up their result, and then they'd write a publication on it. Some of it being rather boring and, well, monotonous, basically. Other times, they were very motivated to do exactly the same things, and they didn't find it monotonous or boring. Admittedly, those individuals seemed to go on to far more successful results later on, particularly employment at universities. And then there are those who, no matter how, let's say, productive their time was, really just felt like it was going nowhere. Understand, they were getting results and they were making progress, it just felt to them like nothing was happening. And this is partly a lack of motivation and support from supervisors, and seemingly a personal issue with it and not feeling exactly motivated. Understand, this is a mixed bag at best. That is, you are going to get random results, and that's kind of what you'd expect. Not everything will always be the same, and at the end of this video we'll touch on some rather useful things to consider if you were looking at going on to postgraduate experiences. Now, the effect of this scenario is arguably both the best and worst, mostly because so long as you're getting exactly the middle ground of this, you're actually going to be becoming a better academic, a better researcher, because you are able to overcome the various hurdles, and you will basically be forced to encounter certain hurdles. Learning how to get over them and get around them is going to mean that you can deal with it later on, and you're not stuck at some point going, what's happening and how do I deal with this? Whereas those who constantly face hurdles will eventually break and just not want to have anything to do with academia anymore or research, and they will burn out. Those that are spoon-fed things, well, they will have no knowledge or preparation. They are walking into a minefield completely blind, and if they're really lucky, they might come out the other end intact. If they're really unlucky, well, they might explode. In a similar vein of, frankly, rather terrible level of research, so we now have the bad end of things, we have students who, working on a project, effectively had the entire project implode on them. Understand, this is not a exaggerated description. They were working on animal research, and unfortunately, due to issues around the ethics committee, facilities, and various other restrictions, particularly around genetically modified organisms, the entire project just collapsed. And as such, what they'd spent 6, 7, or even 8 months working on out of a 10 to 12 month year went up in flames. And as such, they had nothing to show for it. Now, fortunately, this was at different layers, so the honours students had a means of recovering their absolute disaster and basically got extensions, other training from different supervisors and so on, that allowed them to conduct their research and therefore get their work done. The PhD students, on the other hand, yeah, they partly could get by because they have many years in which to do their PhD and therefore found ways to make up for this shit show, but they also spent about a year trying to not only prepare for this, but then to clean up the mess, which, well, you can imagine how unhappy they were. Now for the last, we can talk about what is best described as the ugly of graduate research degrees, and whilst the student wanted to be anonymous, they were more than happy to tell us about the university, being that they are enrolled at Victoria University, Australia. Now, they went into their degree with several things. The first was an established relationship with an organisation who wanted to work with them to investigate something. Now, this isn't unusual. Oftentimes, students will come in with something prepared, and they can say, I have this arrangement with this organisation, I'd like you to supervise me, and we set up this thing and we run it and we see what happens. Whether it's looking at, say, various sports ball things and how to better monitor and improve upon athletes' performances, how to monitor this particular environmental event, and so on and so forth. The supervisor in this case agreed, and basically after a year of bureaucratic nonsense, which is typical of a university, they were enrolled and started their work. This leads us to what happened a month after enrolling for them, and what we find horrifying and why this is described as the ugly of research and academia. Their supervisor disappeared. Well, more accurate to say, they just stopped communicating. This wasn't great, but this was also the start of their degree, and they had very rough goalposts that they had to work towards. Primarily a literature review, which is just a summary of the state of the art or publications at the time. Now, the challenge for graduate students, or why academia is kind of broken, is that there were no real barriers to completing literature review, and they kept going, but that only took them about a month. Understand, this is a broad literature review initially to get an idea about where things are and find gaps in the research that could be used as a basis for not only their research proposals, but going forwards. From what we've seen, it seems like the student kept trying to contact the supervisor via email and phone calls, and each week they'd send a summary of what was achieved and what would be done, and attempting to get a response. They would be effectively shouting into the void with a complete lack of response. Unfortunately, this is not Nietzsche's void, so it didn't stare back. The student went on to develop their own projects at this point to fill in the time while waiting on their supervisor and university to help. Understand, the university should have stepped in long before now, but hey, this is fairly on. Maybe that something will happen, and, well, the students certainly made things happen where they learned to do basic data analytics for big data. And this is basically taking large data sets like census data, genetics data, certainly things like insurance actuarial data, and taking this information from various government agencies in this case, and they would then analyze this. Now understand, they spent a month and then some more working on literature review, and then another year developing their skills in data analytics. And then another year passed with no supervision, and the university still not helping. The supervisor still wasn't responding, and the collaborating community groups were basically having to say, look, we've given you 2.5 years now, and things have gone nowhere. We have to basically go, there's other people who've offered to help us do exactly the same thing, except they're actually going to do the work. Kinda sucks for the student, as they've basically had something set up and then been screwed something awful. Now, the frustrating thing is that this same sort of research in the same area was very much supported by government publications that came about a year after the student had started their work. And that report found that, well, in this case, with a distance to major cities such as Tasmania, for instance, a person is more likely to die from cardiovascular disease. In other words, the university screwed up so badly that they missed a government report that came out 4 years later because they didn't provide supervision. An amazing feat. Most institutes struggle to be slower than a government, yet somehow this university did. And understand, governments move at the same pace as a glacier, if not slower again. So losing to them in a race involving time is impressive. This left our student up a creek, covered in shit, and in a boat that was just about to capsize, leaving them to drown in a river of shit. This is when a very thin rope was thrown to them, and possibly going to save them. One of those hurdles came up. We mentioned those hurdles early on, and it was the novelty of research hurdle, and the university wanted to know what was happening and why they had not met that milestone. After a brief period of discussion with a helpful bureaucrat, it was passed on to the director, or as it would be in America, a dean or similar chair position, and they were very interested in what was happening and the lack of communication and supervision. This led to the usual bureaucratic response of meetings, emails, and more, where they were keen to fix the issues that they knew nothing about and it should have been brought up to their attention earlier, and that the university would have fixed this if only they had known. Yeah. The problem is not the motivation of the student or the university per se, it was the supervisor who just wasn't being responsive or active, and that the student had no idea about what to do, given a complete lack of any kind of support network within the university. Particularly even the student had raised this with other academics who just didn't know what to do. Now, it took about a year of things to seem to get back on track for them. So kind of shit, but in theory, with allowances for supervisor issues, delays, etc., they could make up for this. But they've also wasted about 2.5 years setting up for a project that just fell through because, well, no support from the university and supervisor, and another year basically trying to do something that ultimately became their thesis, which is rather hilarious. You might be thinking, what a farce, but at least it is solved. No. According to what we have since heard, this is not what happened, unfortunately. So that shit creek, it looks like they end up taking a long, long bath in it. Beyond what we've described, things got worse, because things can always get worse. And in this case, somehow it managed to get worse. First and foremost, they should have been taught the simple lesson. It can always get worse, and if you think otherwise, you lack imagination, as appears to be the case with this student. In this case, the supervisor managed to screw up enough that the associate supervisor or co-supervisor couldn't stay, and a new associate or co-supervisor had to be found. And then they stuffed up issues to deal with the same hurdles that finally got submitted, a phenomenon that apparently occurred several more times. So you effectively have bureaucratic hurdles that the bureaucrats involved at the university are very touchy about, kept getting somehow or other made a mess of, and we're trying to be polite about how this appears to have happened. Eventually the project had to be changed, not due to COVID as you might think, which would obviously be relevant given the time frame, but because the original collaborators effectively had to go elsewhere. So this was a second collaborative project that had to be shut down. A second collaborative project that the student had brought with them to the university saying, I have a group who's willing to work with me on this. The new project, thankfully, was still organised by the student, and they literally managed to convince the community group again to work with them, and they managed to extend this out using a government-based health service, basically a hospital. Now, being a government-funded hospital, they are very hard on collaborations and rules, and you had to pass through a lot of those steps in order to get anywhere near doing a project with them. And simply put, because the government spends money on it, they get very funny about where that money goes. Not something you can say about a lot of what the government thinks when it comes to money. You can imagine what happens when you get poor supervision and a stickler for rules, and even more so for outside partners. Yeah, this also went very badly for the student. The collaboration basically became a hot mess as the supervisor's instructions ran completely contrary to the collaborator instructions, which when you have on one hand effectively a government agency or hospital and a university administrator and supervisor saying two opposing things, you are the literal grist between the millstones. You are in the middle of a rock and a hard place, and as the student, well, soft and squishy. This did go exactly the same way as with every other collaboration the student had managed to set up. The difference is that it also aggravated government employees and wasted their limited resources. Good job, Victoria University. You made another mess of a collaboration. The next mess was the final hurdle before submitting the thesis for the student. This was a panel presentation and document assessment. They looked at the proposed step to finish the project on time and at a level suitable for the degree. This was rather obviously complicated by collaborator withdrawals, lack of supervision, and the fact that the student had effectively completely written their thesis by themselves without any kind of support from anyone, let alone a supervisor. And in some cases, supervisors directing the student to do exactly what the student should not do or say. And yeah, this ultimately led to what could kindly be described as a rehearing of what was presented. Sadly, it wasn't the final hearing. The final mess was even more impressive, and this was that the thesis was submitted, and it included work that was done at the very start of the degree. You remember that work on big data and that the student basically self-taught themselves? Yeah, that work. It made up the thesis, and that is the thesis that was examined. Effectively, the work that was done in the first year or thereabouts of the student's degree out of 5 years. And you can imagine that basically with absolutely no input from the university, supervisors, or any kind of help, the examination went poorly. The criticism of it were basically all the things the supervisors had insisted on. These same supervisors who would have been and should have been doing this for over 10 years, if not more again, and they themselves should have examined various theses over the years. With this shit show in mind, the effects are kind of obvious, at least initially. The student has basically decided that further involvement in any kind of academic environment is just not going to happen. That sucks since they seem to be quite proactive and very much interested in making a difference in terms of research that has real-world applications. Not theory, not ideas, but actual things that can be put into practice and make people better. Not only that, but they set up at least 2 different collaborative projects, and also took the initiative to learn how to code and analyze big data while not being supervised. They're clearly perseverant, or at least stubborn, given that they stuck around for 5 years and kept working on it. These are arguably desirable elements in research students as they keep going despite the disappointing results they were getting, and the fact that they were essentially beaten by supervisors into submission, or theoretically something akin to that. It is a real-world example of the morale poster that says something to the effect of, beatings will continue until morale improves. The other effects in this situation are far less obvious. Since the student went on their own way, they don't have supervisors anymore. This is simply to their benefit as, you can only be abused so much before you have to make a choice as to what you do with the abusers. They have since submitted their thesis, as mentioned, given it's been examined, but the university has fundamentally told them to suck it up given the situation. And, ironically, seeking outside help from the government, student union, and elsewhere has been more than disappointing. The worst irony of all is that other university staff from completely different institutes have been more helpful and productive than their university has, and they're not even a student there. Yeah. Others have said that since this is such a mess and no obvious resolutions are available, they can't help when you look at outside sources. Further, the student who spent more than 5 years working to complete their degree has no use for it afterwards, which means that a student who could have done something productive with their life and gone on to other research, other academic work, teaching and so on, lost that opportunity because Victoria University decided to screw a student. A student who, in the course of preparing for this video, we discovered effectively missed out on at least 2 years of their high school education, this being forms 10 and 11, or roughly years 10 and 11 in American systems, due to mental health issues, and yet still went on to effectively complete a postgraduate degree, despite every challenge we've described so far. Not just they can't use a degree because, well, as mentioned, that student doesn't want anything to do with it anymore, but because they can't use anything they learned in the way they were trained to do. This means a student who spent somewhere between 3 and 5 years in an undergraduate degree, and now another 5 years in a postgraduate degree, isn't going to use all that time and effort. There's also the issue that all the time and effort they have spent so far basically is informal skill building, at least with regards to their graduate degree, and that won't be recognized because there's no paperwork for it. And they also lack references because, well, they had no choice, for their own sanity it seems, to walk away from their shitty supervisors. And that means no references about what they did, how or why. And no real way to apply for further work either in academia, even if they wanted to go into industry or something similar. The worst part for us, at least, is that the supervisors who've done such a shit job at Victoria University have no consequences, it seems. Literally, nothing is stuck to them, despite clear paper trails to show the failures across the board and the damage done, which is amazing. The universities have taken the worst aspects of bureaucracy and gone, that's a great idea, let's take that, but take it up to 11. These scenarios are obviously very brief and mostly brief depictions of the different possible outcomes for your average graduate research student, or in the case of honours, undergraduate. They can have a great time and, with supportive supervisors, a project that just works, and go on to great things. They have a pathway to success. They know how to do research, but a lot of the time when you just have this simple, smooth road, it lacks a certain streak of perseverance and resilience generated by a modicum of adversity. Sure, we're not saying that you should be slaving away 23 and a bit hours a day with your project, and in the remaining few minutes you have, they're basically time in the bathroom, and that's all you get. But certainly, some adversity is needed to develop necessary skills. In other cases, it's a more mediocre experience. There's nothing bad, but nothing special either. The students in this situation come out with no great expectations or skills, but also no deficits. This does also mean that there is no overwhelming motivation to continue in research, partly because they don't think necessarily that it will be easy, but there's also no great barrier to them. Sure, inertia can carry them through, but there's also no real driving force, but that works both in propelling them forwards into further research, but also stopping them. Finally, we have the hot mess of what happens with certainly the bad, but more importantly the ugly of graduate research students. The very example of what happens when you have an unstoppable force and what was initially an immovable object giving way to that unstoppable force. Oftentimes it's a failure of both supervisors and institutes, and a lot of the time it's failures to care for and ensure students are not abused by the system. Also that when that does happen, there is a complete failure to do anything about it. The problems are those we've already mentioned, that is, those who are well set up as students will go forward and they'll struggle somewhat to deal with the challenges they will face. That is, if they don't have any challenges at first. But it does keep them motivated, encouraged and willing to go forwards. The middle ground gives a good balance of these, but it'd be better off if things went a little bit easier, but also they had slightly more pronounced challenges. The last example is the dirty underbelly of academia. The problem is that these different situations will represent wildly different scenarios and treatment. It also means that students going into academia are basically going into a lottery where they may win or they may fail. And if you're really unlucky, you're going to wind up basically addicted to gambling. That is, to go on to further academic work when you've already had a shit supervisor, and then another, and you keep losing, thinking one day you'll win big. But the difference here is at least they're not necessarily losing money with a rough but workable experience. Or they might wind up waking up in a bathtub full of ice and missing a kidney, in the worst case scenario. But this doesn't really reflect the negative effect it has on their life and future in academia. For that we need to look at the students who are going to basically be running for the hills to escape. As demonstrated, the students who are not only incredibly motivated, and importantly, very proactive in what they're doing, will basically be leaving academia because they keep getting screwed over. And unfortunately, that's not something that's going to be solved because you are literally chasing out the most active and arguably what would be the most meritorious of research students. And it's because they find themselves not only without the support network they once had or need, but that the university does nothing about it. This is why those that have a bad experience but come out okay leave academia, but continue to use their skills, while not really finding themselves in the same realms of academic work. Most often, they'll work in industry, rather than going on to be a student in a graduate degree. If they're doing a master's, if they're doing a PhD, they may never come back to academia. This is why academia will gradually break down. The students who are spoon-fed to the top are unready for reality. Those who can manage the shit show are leaving to go the industry pathway. Those that are dealt the worst hand just leave and don't look back. All of this with no real oversight or regulation, it seems, especially as demonstrated with the ugly side of academia. And that means those who are going to go on to the future, particularly those who will be supervisors for students, are basically going to be those who understand that rather than have a student develop skills, learn how to do research and everything else, need to be told everything to do as though they were children in research, not actually develop the skills themselves. Now, not all institutes, not everyone, yada 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 yada, but certainly from the examples we've pointed out. And as such, academia is fundamentally broken, and will get worse over time. Unfortunately, that will also mean that slowly but surely, academia will not just break down, but will collapse in on itself as these failures mount up. And as they get more and more over time, we're going to see the consequences. And it's not going to be people with brightly colored hair screaming. It's going to be that research lacks integrity, that research results can't be replicated because, well, somebody stuffed up an experiment and then everybody thought it was fine and published results anyway. And in some cases, it's going to have real world, real health, or other human direct ramifications, such as medications that don't do what you think they will. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do provide any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.